This real-side experience would begin with my being present on a kind of other dimensionally placed island. The overall impressions as afforded via the real awareness was that this island, wherever in multi-dimensional creation it was located, was of great significance, as though I and others had some business there, business of a life and awareness beneficial variety. Although the impressions were as to the importance of this creational position, no impressions were forthcoming as to the specifics, other than what the island contained as being a means of advanced technological utilizing, and indeed nothing simulated, nothing visual was afforded the personal self that could shed any literal clue in regards to the island. Just that this was an emerging first step for another assignment, that this might then develop in subsequent real-side experiences my personal self may be shown, and maybe where more detail is provided. My impressions were that as the dark forces always are watching, physical level and multi-dimensionally, the moment the personal self receives the real side simulated views of the situations and creational positions we are operating within, and the moment the personal self also receives and interprets the real awareness impressions in relation to the experiences, the dark forces also will then be able to access all that the personal self has seen and interpreted. The real awareness, however, where the impressions originate from, is the everything isness reality, where although every creationally operating body type will be this same isness real awareness reality, as the dark forces choose to resign themselves to the consciousness personal self only, isolating themselves from the real awareness that they are, and the oversight of all creation and impressions the real awareness can provide, so the only source of input available to them is on the creational simulated side. They cannot access that which those on their awareness processes, as they lean toward ever more so their real awareness positioning, can. As such, with certain more sensitive assignments, so the details are omitted to an extent, or even sometimes entirely. The simulation pertaining to the experience also denied that most, if not all, detail regarding the delicate assignment is retained with the real awareness isness reality, and isn't filtered through to the personal self, the consciousness simulated arena which the dark forces share and can then access. For indeed, the dark forces seek to subvert, infiltrate, and infect every situation that it can be turned into another mechanism of control, and with certain assignments, so it's necessary to prevent the dark forces being able to access details regarding them, where they then can interfere, disrupt, derail, or utilize what was to be in some way beneficial to instead become another opportunity for further restriction of others. Hence why, as impressions suggested, my personal self only would receive the vague notion of another dimensionally placed island of some technological significance, and perhaps then what was taking place in regards to this was proceeding, but nothing of the specifics would my personal self be shown, until maybe at such time that the specifics then entering the consciousness personal self simulator arena wouldn't then matter, as maybe beyond a certain stage, even with the dark forces then determining also the details, and even with their attempted disruption, their actions would have a minimal bearing on whatever this assignment entailed. The following scene would be related to the technological island, however, for I would find myself in a random, simulated position of no other significance than this was the location where a particular being would establish a contact with me. I would in fact be in a building that presented as a kind of amusement centre. A bowling aisle was present, various arcade machines and the like. I waited patiently, as my impressions were that I was to be approached here by an individual, and indeed would a being now be striding towards me. He was a kind of a reptilian body type, though the scales that his skin comprised of were black. He would have a very sharp and lethal-looking claws extending from his fingers, his body wrapped and mostly concealed in a black cloak. Through the design of the body types can we determine to an extent their consciousness design, for the more restricting of others the being is, the more twisted the consciousness design happens to be, the more abrasive are the life choices. This affects then a body form in an equally as distorted measure to such a consciousness. And through the body forms themselves we can ascertain the kind of consciousness overall intent that effects such. But of course, many of those of an ill-intended persuasion are stepping up and choosing to become more aware also, and so we may be seeing the body forms as they currently are, as a reflection of the distorted consciousness they previously held to, but very likely then the affected form will change accordingly on the real side, taking the moments it will to filter through physical level-wise, that a reptilian they may be in their current lifetime, but should they say transition, a human or less distorted form they may be in the next lifetime, etc., if in fact they require further lifetimes to recognize the years from. For indeed, despite the appearance of the reptilian being that approached me, he had indeed been previously of an ill-intended proclivity, and very likely serving in a dark force capacity of some kind. He now was deciding to step up and embrace the real purpose of his recognition. He possessed of a very capable body form, with all manner of abilities and psychic science skills through his chosen consciousness development. He would have been considered then to be a black magician of a very high standing, but now, as I said, he was electing to become more aware. He also desired to be of assistance, life and awareness beneficially speaking, in whatever capacity he was able, and so would bring his considerable developed psychic science abilities to the table, that they serve to support life and not be restricting of it, as was his prior decided function. He still would have his personal self-attitudes, as we all will have, as we must deal with our creation while going through the process of awareness until we have no further need of it, and as he was just at the initial stages of embracing the recognizing journey, and given the design of his overwhelmingly ill-intended consciousness up until this point, he had rather the quirky personal self to have to manage. As an example, although impressions verified his extraordinary capability, he was always keen to demonstrate his powers. Very self-satisfied was he with his consciousness body form creation, though as he proceeded with his awareness process, undoubtedly this psychic science infatuation would become less pronounced. But for now he would intend to immobilize me with but a wave of his scaled clawed hand, as a demonstration of his power. But as I lacked any agreements in my consciousness, any ideas that were in regards to the allowing that this being could in any way bestow his powers upon me, he in fact would be unable. For unless the ideas are present in a consciousness, that which are effected from them cannot be experienced. However, my sense was to play along, so to speak, for oftentimes, when we are dealing with the personal selves of others, we will cater to their ego if it makes sense to do so. For in this case, were I not to go along with his little performance, this may upset him, that would prove unnecessarily disrupting to his awareness process that had only begun, and additionally he was an individual I was to make a contact with, and had I remained unaffected by his powers, very likely the experience may have ended there, and he walk away. Stepping up he may be, but only in the very preliminary stages of doing so, his personal self still very strong, and leaned more so toward. So I was content to play his game, and although I had no agreements where he could exact his powers over me, in such circumstances then, as it becomes prudent that we consciously agree to such ideas, where it makes sense to do so, I would consciously permit this, and I would be immobilized as he desired. This seemed to satisfy him, especially as the crowd that also had gathered were in awe of this display of power, further bolstering his ego, and he would fade from the scene, my immobility lasting a few more moments before dissipating. My agreeing to be subject to his power would pay off as anticipated, for as I vacated the amusement centre, I would encounter him again in the streets that surrounded the building, and revealed was that not only was he intending to step up and become more aware, but he was somehow an essential key regarding the very technology housing other dimensional island I was to access. The brief impression of it I had received where this experience began. For now he would present me with a curious talisman that had been strung around his neck. This was seemingly an essential tool for accessing the island, in conjunction with his abilities and technological know-how. The talisman was an artifact that had to be charged, and only could be if the bearer had the ability to do so, if their consciousness was of such a design that this had the affected body forms emit a certain frequency that would bring the talisman to life, and very likely the talisman would serve as a key of a kind for accessing the island. This reptilian, although in possession of the talisman, that it served various purposes for him, he didn't have the consciousness designed in the way required that it would also serve as a kind of a key for accessing the technology island. He had other abilities that were also essential for breaching the island, but these had to be in conjunction with a being or beings with a certain consciousness that would activate the talisman he carried. And as my consciousness had the design required, so the idea was that he and I would travel to the island, once I had charged the talisman. In the meantime, he would wait for me. He gestured toward a nearby forest where he would remain until I was ready and the talisman fully charged and activated through my unique consciousness-affected body-form energy field. Then through the forest we would go, representing the first stages of our trek to the island. Perhaps not really such a trek. The real awareness can position its simulated forms anywhere in creation, and really then we only utilize what has been decided through a consciousness as means of point-to-point motion, portals, spacecraft, forest treks, if there is a benefit derived from doing such. The individuals we may encounter on the way, that such adventures then stick more in the memory and are as an aid to real side experience recall on waking, etc. The mechanism by which the talisman had to be charged through my particular energy field involved activating the same kind of psychic science abilities the reptilian held dear, and specifically in relation to others. One means would be to attack others with such abilities, where only through their agreements would success be so, with such a choice to be abrasive. But even if agreements were lacking, and my attacking efforts failed, the talisman would still charge up regardless. Or as an alternative, rather than be abrasive, the reptilian had suggested I frequent a particularly rough area of the creational position we were in. That guaranteed would I be attacked by the ill-intended characters that resided there with no provocation on my part, and so this would be a justifiable defense. Very likely the real awareness would have handled the situation in whatever way it would under other circumstances, but in light of this situation, the real awareness would instead defend the simulated self from the inevitable assailants by utilizing specifically the psychic science skills, which would ignite a certain part of my body form energy field and charge the talisman. Really then, I was just making use of an idea that had been decided, created, and consciousness installed, the affected talisman and its application. But as I said, as this was a consciousness decided as to be the mechanism by which the technology island could be accessed, and this seemed to be my overall objective, it made sense to utilize these particular idea-affected simulated features, that which had been decided in a consciousness creation. And so I would enter the most dangerous areas of this creational area, the back streets, some of the taverns, etc., and as the reptilian had assured me, it wasn't long before I was being assailed by the ill-intended, abrasive beings who dwelled there. They would be unable to harm me, agreements were lacking that allowed that they could, the means of my defense coming in the form of psychic science abilities as orchestrated by the real awareness, and the talisman would indeed charge up accordingly. At one point, as I walked down especially forbidden streets, where only the brave or the foolish would dare to trespass, or those with the need to power a talisman, I was beset upon by hordes of stone-like creatures, in the vague semblance of bipedal two-legged forms. But despite the danger they only could pose to those who held agreements that they could be destroyed by the stone beings, with my absence of such agreements, again this presented as another means of powering my talisman, through the psychic science abilities I wielded in my defense. Finally, the talisman was fully charged with the energy as exuded from my own particular energy body field. I would make one final stop, entering a kind of a conference being held in this dubious area of creation. The individual on the podium giving the lecture would speak of the legend of the talisman, the very one I had in my possession, that was imbued with all manner of powers, that the holder of it could be potentially in a position to exact great harm simulator-wise, or great benefit. As I vacated the conference, I had slipped in and out unnoticed. I would now endeavour to rendezvous with the Reptilian as he waited for me in the forest, where our journey then to the Technology Island would begin from. Interestingly, I was joined now by two other body forms, a fox and a cat, that despite their appearances, these were not body types prior to the establishing of the secondary free will utilizing personal self, where such earth-based physical level animal forms are typically animated directly by the real awareness, absent of the additional obfuscation the personal self-consciousness immersion affords. These were the exterior forms, as chosen by what impressions revealed were two other beings on their own respective awareness processes, where the secondary personal self had been created, but was in the process of progressively being held in indifference and detachment to, and these two beings, in the forms of a fox and a cat, were also instrumental key elements in regards to accessing the Technology Island in whatever capacity this might be, along with the Reptilian and his remarkable developed consciousness-affecting body form abilities, and my own uniquely developed consciousness, which had allowed the talisman to be charged in a particular way that it served as a kind of a frequency key also. The experience would end there, as I would proceed toward the forest where the Reptilian awaited, with my fox and cat associates, and it will be interesting to see how this develops.